Hello and welcome to this episode of the Creative Venture Podcast and the new Asking Experts series, where I sit down with experts in their field that have complementary skills to help you on your creative venture. Today I'm talking to Transformational Coach Tanya Collins. Tanya has a degree in physiology and has centered her career around people. She's trained in Neuro-Linguistic Programming, emotional freedom technique, and a number of other coaching modalities. She currently has her own business supporting issues as far-ranging as sports and business performance to helping individuals with PTSD, depression, and addiction. In this episode, I chat to Tanya about some of the key themes holding creatives back and what we can do about them. Tanya gives some great insight, having exhibited her own artwork on several occasions, and talks about the creative journey as both a coach and an artist. In this episode, we discuss the key things holding creatives back, daily routines, how language patterns can help improve business and romantic relationships, and why you might want to become emotionally clearer.
When you are authentic, when you are standing in your truth, not everybody's going to agree with you, but there will be a lot of people who do. When you start doing that, the benefits outweigh the risks.
Tanya Collins, I'm really happy to have you with me. I'm so excited about this one because this is a little bit different. So thank you so much for agreeing to do the podcast with me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm actually quite intrigued to see how it turns out, and it's a real honour to be asked. So thank you, Mark.
It's great to have you. So this is a bit different really, because normally I would be interviewing people that are actively pursuing a career in creativity. But I think it's so valuable to hear from another side, but talking about the same sort of topics. So you work as a transformational coach. Just tell me a little bit about, well, firstly, how you got started, and then, tell me a little bit about coaching and what it's all about.
Okay, very, very quick potted history about how I got into coaching. If I step from what I'm doing right now, I learnt what I do right now in February 2014. But what got me on that road was I was working in the prison service for many years.
Yeah, very different, right?
Very, very different. And one of my governors, I got given quite a senior role in a very large West Midlands prison. And he very, very kindly sponsored me to train in something called Neuro-Linguistic Programming, which I loved. And the intent was to help challenge the culture and to change the culture of the staff group that I was working with. Now, I loved it, and the woman who trained me was incredibly holistic and trained it very thoroughly. And I did some more training with her the following year. And ended up talking to different groups and different management teams about language and how language impacts your thoughts and how you can seek to influence people ethically using language and how you interact and being aware of the impact of your language on other people. So when I left the prison service, I got introduced by an old colleague to a different style of coaching, and it does create transformational change. Prior to the prison service, I'd also worked with people. I'd worked with different organisations, and I had found through my career that I loved working with people. I loved working with challenging people. I loved working with challenging situations, and my career has been kind of built on that predicate, and I knew that I would always end up working with people. And interestingly, the coaching that I do now ranges from people with emotional issues, say anxiety or depression, but all the way through to professional business performance coaching. But because of my history in the prison service and before then with different organisations, a lot of my career has been about risk management and holding space for difficult conversations. So in the prison where I got trained in NLP, some of my roles there and with prison subsequent to that was case managing actively suicidal men.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with quite risky situations, having to deal with high emotion, sometimes very volatile situations in an operationally demanding environment. If you didn't know before you joined the prison service, you cut your teeth very quickly in building your interpersonal skills.
Yeah, massively.
But prior to the prison service, my jobs were about that too. So I kind of came in a little bit with corners knocked off and a bit ready to go.
Yeah. Well, I know from our conversations off mic, you've had some really interesting situations that you've had to deal with and definitely gained some incredible experience. And I think it's going to be really valuable to get your thoughts on some of the hurdles that will that creatives will face in their creative ventures and in the life cycle of a project. But first, just tell me a little bit about what NLP is for those who may not be aware, and is it something they may want to look into?
Do you know what? It is a phenomenal toolkit, and yes, people are likely to want to look into it because it effectively gives you the toolkit of how your brain works and how you then interact with your own physiology and what you do and your behaviours and your emotions. So neuro-linguistic programming, neuro, nerves, thinking, linguistic, language, programming. We learn behavioural patterns when we're really, really young, and that's kind of the premise of what I do with my coaching, which is a mix of lots of different things. But it was basically designed by a chap called Richard Bandler, working with a chap called Grinder. And they were looking at some psychotherapists and noticing that some psychotherapists actually had a really phenomenal impact with their clients. And they started analysing the language that particular psychotherapists used and found that by using language in specific ways, which these therapists had been using consciously and unconsciously, they could model that. And then they built up the baselines of neuro-linguistic programming, which keeps on developing and keeps on growing and creates different arms. So yeah, it's a phenomenal toolkit. It will educate you in your self-talk, in how you use your language, and the impact that you can have on yourself and your own behaviours, but also on other people. NLP, it has been slated in a lot of circles for being manipulative, but
Right.
but a tool is a tool. Having worked in prisons, a hammer can be used to hammer in a nail. A hammer can also be a weapon. So it's about the ethics of what you're doing and how you're using it, because anywhere we're impacting people, it's about your intent and your ethics, which I feel very, very strongly about.
Yeah, that's great to mention as well, just in case, people start Googling things and think, oh, well, there's one dodgy article. And, I think it's great to sort of to bring that round and say that. So thank you for mentioning that. And then I'll dive into some of the specifics in a second, but in the slightly broader sense, what would you say that are some of the key things that are holding creatives back? Have you got any thoughts on what they might be?
Do you know what is really interesting? Because I'm a bit of a closet creative myself, so I've kind of had some of these experiences, although I'm not what you'd call professional in terms of my creativity. But in terms of what holds people back, that could apply to creatives but also other people. So quite often people are held back because they're either doing something that's self-sabotaging and not helping them, which is then having a wider impact. So they're doing behaviours that they don't want to be doing, or they're not doing something that they want to, so something is holding them back. And quite often, I know that we had a chat about this before we're talking right now, but a lot of that could be about learnt experience, about core beliefs, about I'm not good enough, or what are other people going to think? Or if I put that out there, how is that going to impact my reputation, my business, how my friends think about me, how people interact with me? And I know that I've had this personal experience as a creative because I have exhibited a small handful of times. And the very, very, very first time I put my artwork up on show, do you know what? It's one of the scariest things I've done.
Yeah.
Because, as a manager in a prison service, you can come across some pretty hair-raising scenarios sometimes. But when you're sharing your inner world, bear in mind, a lot of art people may not do for public show. And for me, in this particular instance, putting art on show that I'd never, ever created with a view to showing almost anybody, actually, it is like you're ripping your skin off and you're showing your barest self to people, and you're kind of curious, frightened, scared, nervous about their responses. So that whole thing about other people's perception of you as an artist or a creative, or actually a business person. It doesn't...
it's all the same.
That whole thing. And a lot of people I work with, whether they're creative or not, quite often have self-sabotaging beliefs that they picked up in school, where maybe a maths teacher told them that they weren't so good, so someone pulls in a belief that I'm no good at maths or I'm not creative. Imagine the amount of artists out there who maybe had not such a helpful art teacher who told them not to put green there. it should be red.
Yeah, and we carry this. There's a chap that I follow very closely called Chase Jarvis. I don't know if you've come across him. He's a photographer, but he does a lot of chat around this space. So that might be someone that people want to follow and check him out. But he always talks about like when you go into a class of 5-year-old, they ask the class who wants to draw a picture. But what hand doesn't go up? Everyone wants to draw a picture. But you do that in a business seminar or something with a group of adults. You'll seldom get any hands up, and that's because people are carrying this sort of this shame, this embarrassment, this trauma. And I think that even though people may say, oh, well, that's a bit far-fetched, I mean, maybe try that experiment for yourself, because, something as silly and as playful as that, people really don't like it,
And it's fascinating. I'll give you a very, very brief business example. I was working with one lady who told me that she hated doing her accounts.
Okay.
And it transpired that she had a memory that when she was a kid, she had a dad looking over her shoulder being critical of her maths homework.
Oh, no way. Yeah.
So actually, sometimes the thing is with learning's fascinating because we learn in different ways. We can learn instantaneously.
Mm-hmm.
We learn by literally absorbing and copying. So between the ages of 0 and 7, our brains are either in theta brainwave states. So it's almost hypnagogic. We are literally absorbing, copying and learning. And all of that's at the unconscious level between ages of 0 and 7, 0 and 8.
Mm-hmm.
But we can also learn by repetition. Think about how you learn how to drive. Or we can learn in a single instant where there's maybe a high emotional impact. So you can take your learnings and you might not even realise that you've installed a belief somewhere along the line that might be unhelpful, that might hold you back. And a lot of these things, if you imagine an iceberg, what we see at the top is maybe the top 3%. I mean, an iceberg's at 10, they say 10. But if you imagine the top 3% of the iceberg is above the water, the iceberg is actually supported and driven by everything below the water. All those patterns, all the stuff that we do on a daily basis, most of it's driven by patterns. 95% of what we do is driven unconsciously. That includes emotional learnings, all behaviours driven by emotions. And we have core beliefs that then drive behaviours as well. And we have our value set, which is linked to our emotions, also drives our behaviours. So what is fascinating is when those are running below the waterline, they're driving what's going on. So cognitive behavioural therapy works on the premise that you're thinking about what you're doing. So if you've got your finger on the pulse and you're monitoring every single thought, bear in mind we think about 65 to 90,000 thoughts per day, 95% of which are the same as yesterday. Yeah, it's fascinating. So if you think that we're thinking that amount of thoughts, many of which we're not aware of, they're just in and out, very fleeting. 95% of what we're doing is running a program. So if you want to take conscious control, you have to be consciously thinking about what you're doing, what you're thinking, how you're responding, all of the time. It's possible, but you'd need to be on the ball every single second of the day. However, the minute you start thinking about tomorrow's supper or yesterday's fracas with the cat or whatever you're thinking about, the minute you're going offline and thinking about something else, your body takes over. We've got the perfect example of if you're driving along, where the heck did that last 5 miles go? Oh, now your body learned how to drive. Everything was switched on in terms of your unconscious learnings. You know how to drive. The minute something comes into your system that would be a threat, you would have become aware very quickly and you would have dealt with it. But your reactions would have happened at the unconscious level before you even knew you were reacting. That's happened to all of us, I'm sure. But if you're not consciously monitoring everything all the time, the program takes over. And that program is installed from just before birth all the way through. We can change the programs. There's different ways of doing that. But unless you're aware of what the program is, you can't change it. Part of the awareness is starting to monitor your self-talk. Noticing what you're saying, noticing what you're thinking, but also recognizing that what you're thinking or saying to yourself isn't a truth, it's a pattern.
Yeah. And in terms of that awareness, this is maybe like changing gears a little bit, but I know you're a big advocate of like daily practices.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts on strategies for people trying to calm that mental chatter and the brain going all over the place. Just tell me a little bit about the importance of daily practices really for creatives. So is that something that you'd sort of recommend to people?
Absolutely. Because when you start training your brain to think differently, you start noticing different things. So a simple one that has got a real scientific basis to it, and I do like my science and I do like to prove things, is gratitude.
Yeah.
And gratitude is effectively noticing what you can be grateful for. So actually, there's a really good practice to do, particularly at the beginning of the day. You can do it at the end of the day too, but gratitude is brilliant because when you start actively thinking about and noticing the things that you are grateful for, and I'm not meaning just a kind of a throwaway list, I'm thinking about actually pulling something into your consciousness and really feeling the feeling of gratitude for whatever it is that you're grateful for. So I'm immensely grateful. I have a phenomenally supportive husband. I feel so much love when I talk about him. And when you start feeling the emotion of the gratitude, that's the stuff that starts changing your physiology, but also signalling to your unconscious to start noticing more of the same.
Yeah, amazing.
So, even if it's simple stuff, nowadays, I'm so grateful we've got food on the table. We've got a roof over our heads. Now, if you look at whatever size of the world's population, don't have some of those, what we would call basics. So to have, to live a Western life with the level of privilege that we have, actually being really aware of what you're grateful for sets up your brain to notice more. So there's a piece of our brain around about the size, I believe, although I've not delved in a brain myself, about the size of a thumbnail called the Reticular activating system. And it acts as a filter. So this is the filter that is noticing everything that's going on around you. We take in around about, some say about anything between 2 million to 40 billion bits of information per second, every second. Like every single pixel of light, your unconscious is logging. Every single bit of temperature on your skin, your unconscious is logging. Your heart rate, your physiological state, your emotions, it's logging everything. But your brain filters out that information. Otherwise, you just go crazy if you were aware of everything all at once. So one of the principles, actually going back to NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, is we delete and we distort and we generalize. So deleting might be, okay, right now, Mark, you're not aware of the sensations in your big right toe, but now that I've mentioned your big right toe, I bet you've suddenly
aware of it.
You're suddenly aware of it. Distort. I see a fleck on the carpet. If I had a fear of spiders, that might be a spider until I actually look at it a bit more closely. But I have the instantaneous response to a potential threat. Generalise, I can see a chair. Now that chair might be made up of 25 million pixels as far as I can see, but I just generalise that's a chair. And it kind of cuts down the information overload. So in awareness, you're only aware of around about 1,000 to 2,000 bits. And that reticular activating system is a filter. You can set it. So when you set it differently, by doing gratitude as one example, you actually start noticing different things because you're basically giving it a different instruction. So if I said to you, maybe on the way home, you're going to notice as you're driving all the green cars. Now you say that and we may wryly smile, yeah, but I bet you're going to notice them now because I've said it. So you can actually train your brain. And because we delete so much information, how much good stuff are we missing? So people who are maybe becoming aware of some unhelpful self-talk, they're priming themselves to notice the bad. So I know I've had an experience where I've leapt out of bed one morning, stubbed my toe. Ow! And then that sets up the tone. And then I spill the milk. And then you're in a grumpy mood because you spilt the milk and you've stubbed your toe. So your brain now, it wants, your unconscious actually wants to give you more of what you're asking it. So now it's going to pull up everything else that's a little bit crappy. And then you start having a bad day. But if you start your day actively pulling in good stuff, it's a signal, a very active, conscious signal to give your brain to start looking for the good stuff. And the more you notice, the more you notice. It's really odd how it happens. But you can kind of go off into different discussions about synchronicity then, and it gets a bit wider. But,
yeah. No, it's really, really cool. So I was just thinking, just very quickly, have you got any words on meditation as well? Because I mean, that's something I'm a great advocate of, and I know that that's been something very key to you. Have you got any thoughts on that, or is that something you'd recommend for people?
Yes, I recommend it with a caveat.
Yeah.
If someone has had a difficult past, and if you imagine that their emotional pot is full of old experiences, they might not have resolved them yet.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes meditation is not very helpful initially, because essentially meditation, what you're doing is you're actively choosing to reduce your brainwave state. So right now we're talking, we're conversing, we're probably in beta because we're thinking and we're making eye contact, and I'm looking over this wonderful microphone. So we're thinking. The minute we start relaxing or going into flow state, we drop into alpha. So if you're going to think of your creatives, when you think of a creative in flow state, you lose track of time. You're in the middle of the zone of doing what you're doing. That's alpha. But alpha is kind of the precursor to more relaxed states. So you can kind of drop from alpha into theta. Theta is the brainwave state that your 0 to 7-year-old is in, but equally it's the brainwave state that you pass through just before you go to sleep. So people who are carrying a significant emotional loading might find thoughts drop into their head that they find difficult to deal with.
Yeah.
If you find that you get overwhelmed by too much relaxation or too much meditation, my advice would be go and seek some assistance from another professional. But equally, meditation is a great way to access your own unconscious. So you can use that space of relaxation to connect in with yourself, to connect in with your own inner voice. If you have a spiritual bent, you can start widening your own spiritual awareness through meditation. But actually, even in terms of when you start dropping into alpha and theta, you're changing your body biochemistry, you're reducing cortisol, you're increasing serotonin.
Yeah, you're de-stressing.
You're de-stressing quite literally. And you're allowing your body that chance to switch off. And there are so many people who are on the go all the time. And there's a saying, and forgive me, I don't know who actually said the quote, basically saying if you're too busy to meditate, then you need to do it more. And that's a paraphrase and a poor quote.
No, but it gets the point across. Yeah.
But if you're finding that you're too busy and you're never switching off, that's a kind of a cue that maybe it would be beneficial if you'd put some more quiet time. And I mean quiet, switched off from social media, switched off from the TV. You can use guided meditations, which are sometimes more helpful, or you can just use simple meditation music. Or I started meditating, actually, really started when I was in the prison service. I had a particularly stressful job.
Yeah, for sure.
In 2000, and when was this? 2012, I really started. And on one of my annual leaves in the October, I said, I've got to do something about this. I've got to do something. I started meditating. But I used something then called Binaural Beats. So this is a particular type of meditation music that effectively trains your two brain hemispheres to synchronize up, and it helps to drop you into a different brainwave state.
Yeah, so those thetas and the alphas that you were talking about.
Yeah. And you can even choose the delta ones, which are sleep.
Nice.
So you can actually drop yourself relatively quickly into a deeper meditative state. And I found those incredibly beneficial at the start of my journey. I use them less frequently now. I tend to use some particular people's guided meditations, or I use simple meditation music.
Yeah, excellent. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier is about your art exhibition, and you've been in that sort of like fear state as a creative, which I just think is wonderful because it shows the the diversity of your experience. And for me, one of the things that I noticed in terms of comfort zone is that it's almost like a circle around you, and that I'm either actively expanding it or I'm not pushing out of my comfort zone enough, and it's sort of contracting around me. So I'm just curious, in terms of the audience being creatives, have you got any tips or strategies for overcoming fear?
Fear in a creative is quite interesting, isn't it? Because fear is quite a big blocker. I know I've had the feeling of when I've had a canvas in front of me and it's making the first mark sometimes, or with fabric cutting the first cut, because once you've put the first mark on, it starts dictating how it might turn out.
Exactly.
That's my perspective. I think there is something which kind of comes out of cognitive behavioural therapy as well, about stepping out of a comfort zone and recognising that your comfort zone is there to keep you safe. And the whole actual prerogative of our unconscious is to keep us safe. So our natural stance is to stay safe and therefore stay in our comfort zone.
Yeah.
Sometimes actually feeling a bit of fear and doing it anyway is really beneficial, as long as the fear isn't absolutely overwhelming or completely stopping you. The learning that you get from actually doing something, surviving it, and coming out the other side is actually teaching your body a level of resilience in that you did it and survived. Once you've done it once, you get the learning that you can do it again. And so your comfort zone actually expands because you start getting more comfortable with doing more things. In fact, I've got a friend, she went through a process of saying, right, every single day this month, I will do something that scares me. Now, that might not have been public, that might have been personal.
Yeah.
But the very fact that you start challenging your nervous system, to get almost used to the sensation of it, but don't forget that any emotion when it's going through your body generally has a span. For a regular person who doesn't have traumatic stuff which is triggering it, I'm talking about your regular Joe Bloggses here. An average person where they're wanting to stretch their comfort zone, there is real value in doing something, feeling the fear, but doing it anyway, because that does increase your resilience. But there are things that you can do that will minimize your fear in the moment. So one is a really simple breathing technique, that if you are feeling fear or anxiety in a particular moment, there's something called the 7-11 breathing technique.
Okay.
It's really simple.
Yeah.
And again, there's a physiological basis underneath it that makes it work. The premise is that when you breathe in for a count of 7. And then you breathe out for the same paced count of 11. Now, if you've got small lungs, that could be 5 and 9. If you've got tiny lungs, that could be 3 and 5. But the rule of thumb is you breathe in for less time than you breathe out.
Yeah.
Now, what that actually does is it blows out more carbon dioxide from your lungs. And believe it or not, as an ex-old rusty physiologist, it's the carbon dioxide that creates the breathing response. It's the one that drives the rate of your breathing. So when you get too much carbon dioxide, say you've been exercising, carbon dioxide buildup in your blood will prompt your heart to pump quicker so that you can get more carbon dioxide out of your body through your lungs. So when you blow it out, you're getting rid of it. So your body kind of goes, that's okay, I can calm down now. So your heart rate naturally starts slowing and your breathing rate starts slowing. But also as you're doing this, you're reducing your cortisol again. So you're reducing your stress response. So basically you'd breathe in for 7 and out for 11 for maybe 3 or 4 or 5 cycles, but you'll actually physically feel your body chilling out. Now, I'm trained in lots of different things, and one of them is emotional freedom technique. So someone can go out and look up emotional freedom technique. It's kind of very broadly, simplistically, kind of linked to acupuncture. So if you think about where needles might go, this isn't about needles at all. This is just about literally tapping points on your body. But that can also help reduce stress in the moment.
No way.
In order to enable you to do things. So the lady that trained me to a particular level in EFT. She's worked with hundreds of people. It can take it out in the moment. There might be some other things underpinning that bigger response. So in that case, if you find it's too debilitating, you can't kind of get through an initial fear response using different strategies, then please do seek some additional assistance or support, because there will be a reason behind that. You can drive it. Other things are about keeping saliva in your mouth. Simple. When you're under fear or stress, what happens is the blood moves from your guts to your limbs, ready to fight or flight or freeze. But actually, when the blood goes from your guts, your mucosa dries up because it's not doing anything. You don't need to digest now, you need to run. So you find that your mouth goes dry when you get stressed. So if you can break the pattern in any way, Even by holding saliva on the tip of your tongue and in your mouth, it starts breaking the pattern. Even where you look, if you just raise your eyes, keep your head still, but raise your eyes to the ceiling, you can't then access feelings. You quite often notice that when people are feeling things, their eyes are going down.
It's interesting. Yeah, that's really
so
interesting.
Even if you use a little bit of tricks and tips to get over your initial fear response, you can train your body then to go through it. And then once you've done it, you get the learning, you build your resilience. This is where some of the exposure therapies work. They want people to start building up their resilience to the stressor. I would do things differently. I do things slightly differently with my coaching, but that's the method and how some of those things work.
Yeah. So cool. We're getting some really valuable hacks here, Tanya. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.
So one of the things that I talk about on the podcast, and I wonder if I can make this a relatable segue, but particularly how people can influence, the way that you are, and how it's really important to, choose the people that you spend time with. Ideally, you want people that are on the same path, understand your journey, and are going to add to your creativity and make you energized. But I'm thinking in terms of like values, what are the importance of values? And then also understanding when sometimes things aren't going to work and you need to part company from people. So yeah, just talk to me a little bit about values and, what are they and why are they important?
Yeah, values are hugely important, and they are also part of the landscape underneath the waterline of your iceberg in your unconscious. Your values can actually be changed very, very quickly depending on your life experiences.
Okay.
If you look at Robert Dilts and his neurological levels, somebody can go and look this up.
Yeah.
At the top of the hierarchy, you've got your identity. Underneath that, you've got your values, which are linked with emotions. And you've got your beliefs, and your identity and your values and your beliefs. Most of that runs beneath the waterline. But you know you've got them, because if somebody does something that crosses a value, you get a response, a behaviour or an outburst, or something may happen.
Yeah.
But values are also key to how you respond in certain areas of your life. So if I ask someone the question, so for example, what is important to you about your creativity? They might say, freedom. Freedom is a value. It's not a noun. You can't stick it in a wheelbarrow. Even the word freedom might mean different things to different people, but a value will often drive a behaviour set. So take a step back, ask what's important to you about work. It might be earning money. And what's important to you about earning money? And that might be about freedom for my family. So again, it might come back to, quite often values are single words, but they have big meanings. And behaviours that are linked to values are quite interesting. So if you talk about relationships, a simple example of this might be, if I said to Mr. Smith, okay, what's important to you about your relationship? And he said, love. Okay, if I say to Mrs. Smith, what's important to you about your relationship? She might have a different value, but even if love was her top value, okay, when you know that somebody loves you, what's the behaviour that you know that they're demonstrating to show you that they love you? So Mr. Smith, his top value might be trust. Mrs. Smith's top value might be trust. So they might actually require different behaviours for their partner to exhibit, for them to feel on the inside at an unconscious level that value is being met for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So trust might be about, okay, when you get to a place, just give me a ring and tell me where you are, or let me know when you're coming home, or, we share the opening of the mail. It could be simple things, but equally, it might mean very, very different things to different people. It might be that I don't get my flowers and therefore he doesn't love me. Well, I know that's a load of rubbish, but that's not actually my value set. Love might be flowers and hearts and roses. It might just be about baking bread. I know my husband bakes the most beautiful bread, but I know every single loaf is infused with love.
Yeah.
He's not a hearts and flowers kind of guy, but I know he loves me.
Yeah.
Because the way he bakes his bread. If someone's value set's not being met, might not be that the other person doesn't love them or doesn't trust them. It's just that they're showing it based on the way because quite often we do unto others how we want it ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And that kind of comes back to language and rapport. So go back to Neuro-Linguistic Programming. Yeah. Someone who has a visual learning style you might find that their language is full of, I see what you mean. There's a beautiful colour to that. Their language is full of visual words. Somebody auditory might be, I hear what you mean. That rings a bell to me.
So in terms of wanting to prevent misunderstandings and things, I mean, I appreciate there's probably no perfect solution, but if you're talking to a colleague or a client, is there a better way to bridge the gap between different conversational and learning styles?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you start getting an understanding of how the language actually really does impact the unconscious, and every single word has a meaning for different people. So even the same word that we might have a common understanding of might have a very different internal meaning. So I have a colleague who was doing some business coaching with two executives who were not seeing eye to eye. And she said, right, just have a chat and I will listen. One person was using all visual words. The other person was using all auditory. Now, all you have to do is become aware of how the other person speaks and start not mimicking, but you start interjecting into your own language some of how they think.
Yeah. Have you got any examples out of interest? Just to try and think of if that was the conversation that you're overhearing, what would be a sort of auditory example or a visual example?
Well, a visual person might be going, well, I can really see this. It's black and white.
Yeah.
And then the auditory person might be talking about, well, I hear what you mean, but the visual person wouldn't understand necessarily at an unconscious level that the auditory person has picked up the meaning, and they might also carry on trying to explain in visual terminology.
Would a good way to sort of figure that out be, I'm just thinking outside the box here, but I don't know, if you asked me to describe something,
yes,
is that a really good way of just being able to figure out what sort of...
And you're absolutely bob on there, Mark, because a question I will often ask people is, tell me a little bit about something that you love doing.
Yeah.
So I'll first of all elicit from them, what do you like doing? But it's also because I'm curious. I want to know about the people I work with. But it's also really useful because you start getting into the map of the world about how they think. So tell me, what do you love about running? Oh, I love the feeling of the wet grass between my toes when I run barefoot. And what do you think that is? That's someone who's very kinesthetic, very touchy-feely.
Yeah.
Someone who goes, I love seeing the clouds in the sky as I run towards the horizon. That might be very visual. I love hearing the pounding of my feet through the mud. I love hearing the rustling of the trees. But you might have a mix of language. I love hearing the rustling of the trees and feeling the wind.
Yeah, because that's another thing, isn't it? People can be a mix of things.
Absolutely.
If you think of, I don't know, like a pie chart almost. You're 50% this thing and a little bit of that thing. And so, people are a mix.
They will have a preference, but we're flexible. And this is another thing about, so if you kind of go down the realms of personality testing. Personality tests might give you an output, but that is likely to be a preference. People generally can flex. Given the right circumstances, they can flex and do different things, which is quite often why I might be extrovert with some friends, but I'm actually quite introverted and I get a lot of my energy from recharging quietly.
Yeah, and one of the things that really jumps out there, I think that, if anyone's listening that is a boss or is in any leadership roles as well, like this is something that's really useful to implement with teams, because I think so often not only are there misunderstandings from peers working together, but I think that in terms of getting the best out of your teams, leadership and teaching needs to be delivered in a way that's sort of open to like loads of different people's conversation and learning styles. So I wonder if that could be a factor as well.
Absolutely. Everybody is different. And I think I've certainly had experiences in the past where you get slotted into a box and people sometimes don't see the flexibility inherent within a personality. And beginning to understand that language is indicative of how people tick, you can then start building rapport. We tend to do business with people we know, like, and trust.
Yeah.
And actually, if people are not in rapport, you're not going to get the best out of a situation, either personally or interpersonally. And that also means rapport with your unconscious. So going back to your creatives, if someone is not in rapport with themselves, if they're running an internal conflict, that's going to drain their energy.
So just to segue there, so running internal conflict with regard to language, I know you talk a lot about being mindful of your language patterns, and of course that ties in with NLP. When people are in that whole thing about should and must and all of that, can you just tell me a little bit about how being conscious of your language is important?
Well, isn't it really interesting you raise that? Because when we think about the inner dialogue that we have, there's some interesting language that really, really impacts how we respond to goals, the things that we want to do. I invite any of your listeners to think about something they really want to do, but pop it in a sentence that says, I should do this thing, whatever this thing is. And just really notice how it feels when you say that. And it's similar with must. I must do. So there's an element of patterns that we probably learned when we were younger about having to be told to do something. And there's a feeling of, I've got to do this. So it feels less like a choice and it feels more like an obligation when you put those words in the sentence. Now, that might be cool for some people. It might actually be the fire in the tank to do it. But if it doesn't feel positive, when something doesn't feel positive, kind of going back to emotions are the drivers to behaviour. So if you have a goal that you want to achieve and then you're putting must and should in front of that goal, sometimes that emotion, if it's not positive, might be a blocker. So even just phrasing your sentences slightly differently. So think about your goal now and just put this in the sentence. I can do whatever it is. Just notice how it feels. So you're going to, it might be a really subtle thing, but run that sentence through your own system a few times. I can do.
Yeah. There's two things that sort of jump out there, because I'm just thinking, one, in terms of strategies, it might be worth, and correct me if this is not going to be helpful, but is it worth maybe when you're feeling a block, as you say, to maybe sit down and just record your voice talking about the thing that you want to do, highlight some of that language if it's present, and maybe try and do some affirmations around the particular new positive language as well.
Yeah, and I think those are very, very interesting. So affirmations with positive language can be very, very positive. Again, I have a caveat.
Yes.
If you are saying a positive affirmation, an affirmation in theory should be present tense, positive. It is now, whatever it is that you're affirming.
Sure.
If when you're saying it, you get an internal bit of dialogue that goes, no, well, that's a load of rubbish, isn't it? Or you get a feeling on the inside, it doesn't sit quite right inside as you say it. That's indicative of some kind of internal resistance about that particular affirmation that you're saying. There was a chap called Noel St. John who changed affirmations around a bit.
Yeah.
And he said, turn it into a question, because going back to the reticular activating system, this thing that we can set the filters on, our unconscious wants to answer questions. So if your affirmation is, I am so happy, or I am so creative, you can say, why am I so creative? And your unconscious kind of goes, well, I've got paint, I've got a recording studio, and I can do this, and I've got this time. So even at an unconscious level, your unconscious wants to answer things positively. So affirmations, change them into positive, present tense, focused questions. Why am I so?
I think that's a really nice tool as well. It sounds for like getting rid of self-doubt, because I think that if you give a statement of how am I going to finish this thing, it's like, well, you actually know more than you probably give yourself credit for. You've done this before, you've done things that people have given you positive feedback on. So yeah, it sounds like a really cool, powerful tool there.
And there's another little trick. So going back to the theta brainwave state, I heard this from a chap called Dr. Bruce Lipton, who is a bit of a hero, a scientist again. But he has said you can, and I've done it. I've recommended it to different clients. Record some stuff that's really positive, very affirming, very helpful, and play it on a loop as you fall asleep.
Yeah.
So you can actually start accessing your theta brainwave states yourself by naturally just utilising that bit of the day.
It's like getting into the subconscious almost.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
but make sure they are positive, affirming, present tense.
So just to move on to another question, and this is a theme I've wanted to explore on the podcast, but I haven't really known how to go about it and how to ask. But I think, if if not now, then perhaps never.
Ooh.
So I think you're a great person to ask about this. But but obviously everyone's going to have their own hardships and baggage, just as anyone. But as a creative, you need your emotions to be in good check to be able to do your work and all of that. So when we're looking at low mood, and more specifically like depression and feeling in a rut, have you got any sort of thoughts and advice around that for the creative audience?
That's really interesting, because I've heard that a lot of creatives believe they need some of that angst in order to create. So it depends on whether that angst is productive and it helps you produce what you want to produce, because every single emotion has a value. We have emotions for reasons. So if someone violates one of my values, for example, going back to values, if someone violates a value of mine, it is likely that I'm going to feel angry. And it might be very appropriate to express that. If someone violates my value of trust, it might be that I do feel hurt, and it's appropriate to feel that hurt and to express it. The problem can come is if we don't express it. So for creatives, because creativity is about expression, whether that's writing, whether that's poetry, whether that's painting, sculpture, audio, filmmaking, no matter what that creative output is, the emotions can be a massive driver into creating that content. My caveat would be is if the emotions become overwhelming, unhelpful, there's no outlet for them that actually allows that emotion to work through your system and dissipate. Because if you watch a toddler might get angry, they might stomp their feet, but sure as eggs is eggs, that emotion passes through their system.
Because they've worked it through.
They've worked it through because they've expressed it, it's done, and then 5 minutes later they're giggling. Now, a lot of adults are taught as young people not to express their emotions. So that's sometimes how it can become problematic, because people think there's a problem if they express their anger or their hurt or whatever emotion it is. As a creative, people can use that. The caveat, as I said, if it's too much, and if it stops you or blocks you, or it becomes destructive or unhelpful, it's about a balance. Every emotion has its place.
And just thinking for people that might be in that situation, if they are feeling stuck or like total lack of motivation and that sort of thing, what sort of strategies might you suggest?
That's a really interesting question, because quite often, well, again, lack of motivation is about being blocked by an emotion or a set of emotions. That people won't even realise they're necessarily running. And that lack of motivation could come from many, many different types of sources, or even just general stress, because stress has a massive impact on our bodies and us and our creativity and what we do. So I think to give one strategy would be quite difficult. And actually, if someone finds that there is a lot going on, again, I would recommend going to see somebody to start unpicking what that is, because with the right kind of assistance, you can break through those blocks quite quickly. I had a picture once that I was doing a pastel drawing, actually ended up being exhibited, but this pastel drawing was a complete and utter mess. And I got in a very angry state with this pastel drawing, and I said, right, that's it, it's going in the bin. And my husband said to me, if you put that in the bin, it is DIVORCE.
Oh, no.
At which point I kind of put it to one side, and then I went back to it a few days later. And because I was so angry with the piece of work, it was almost like, flipping heck. It can't get any worse. And I'm not going to be rude, but there was a phrase I said that basically went, I'm doing it. And because I had that level of disregard for the piece, because in my mind it was going in the bin, it reached a tipping point. It just clicked, and something happened to it. So there was like a moment of alchemy, because I'd almost gone through the effort moment. So there's something about
coming to the edge and coming back.
Yeah. And I think when you go over an edge of, actually, I don't care now, which also as a creative, there's something about just make the mark.
Yeah, just start.
Make the mark and start.
Yeah.
And there's something about resonance. So speaking about the spiritual stuff, when you are authentic, when you are standing in your truth, not everybody's going to agree with you, but there will be a lot of people who do. And I can tell you from exhibiting my own work, the scariest thing was putting stuff on the wall that I didn't like, but I was trying to fill a gap. And there were people that loved it. There's something about just be yourself.
And the audience finds you in some ways. When you start finding people that resonate with what you're talking about, and all of a sudden you've got all the same interests. And
even if you don't have the same interests, sometimes there's just a resonance that people get you and get it.
Get what you're about,
And the more we stand in our own truth, the more we find our people. Now, some people are going to drop away. That's natural, that's life. It's frightening being authentic sometimes because of that. What are they going to think about me? But when you start doing that, the benefits outweigh the risks.
Yeah, massive. Hey there guys, we're not over just yet, but I just wanted to chime in really quick and just say, if you're not already following us on Instagram and Facebook, we are at The Creative Venture. Our contact links are also in the show notes, the episode description. And if this content has brought you any value, then I'd really appreciate if you could follow us on social media. Also drop me a DM, I'd love any feedback. But without further ado, on with the show. So one of the things I know that we've discussed as well, off the mic, is about when people get clear about things. And it's just really interesting when I have those moments of clarity, and when you talk about authenticity, you're within your truth. Sometimes that doesn't necessarily mean just taking opportunities, but it means saying no to people and things and stepping back. And that also is a really valuable decision, which I think a lot of creatives might struggle with, the saying no, the turning away, the leaving the job. So just talk to me a little bit about what happens when you get clear, and how can we get clearer?
The getting clearer bit it's a multi-layered piece of work that never stops, and we are evolving and changing all the time. And life, it's a bit like a spiral. You come back to old learnings and think you've done it, but you haven't. There's more learnings to be had. But in terms of getting clearer and the impact that can have on people, I'll come back to the how-tos in a minute. Actually getting clearer in who you are as a person. And that means your values, your beliefs, what makes you tick, what you are prepared to accept, what you are not prepared to accept. When you get really clear on that stuff, you might find that, as I said, you start to resonate in different circumstances and things become clearer and easier. But equally, you can also find that sometimes things get a bit more tricky or a bit more difficult, and perversely a bit more stressful, because you are really clear in what your own truth is. And so I've worked with several couples. So this is an example. If a couple comes to see me, we will do a bit of group work to start with, but we also then do some individual work about their values. But ahead of doing any work with either of them, I will always say, I can help you as an individual become clearer on who you are and what your needs are, and facilitate you making some internal changes for yourself to ditch old baggage. But in that process, you might find that as a couple, you grow together or you grow apart, because you are actually now realizing the truth of who you are.
Uncovering your truth.
But what's interesting is when people do that, difficult decision-making can actually become easier because you're in your truth. So it can help facilitate the decision-making and the movement through tricky things because you're standing in your truth. That's been my experience with clients and my own journey.
And if people want, they're listening to this thinking, oh man, that sounds good, I want a taste of that. How do they suddenly step into their truth?
Well, it's for me, I'm very, very blessed that I've come across some coaching methods that are incredibly helpful. And they literally help people to firstly recognize where the patterns might have come from, but then just dissolve them really, really, really gently. And quite literally, when you're dissolving the old patterns, then the old behaviours generally don't stick around unless you continue choosing that behaviour. And that's a different discussion.
And one other thing as well, I just want to jump in with as well, was in my knowledge of NLP and the work that you do, a lot of this stuff, if I'm right, isn't about counselling as such. You're not talking about the actual this happened and that happened. I mean, you talk about it, to use your phrase, it's very clean. So am I right in thinking it's not something that people need to necessarily divulge a whole load of stuff into if that's not their thing?
No, some of the coaching that I do is clean. I don't need people to discuss the details or revisit anything in great detail, which means that I can keep people out of any difficult memories whilst we do the work.
Yeah, very cool.
And it's, when you're in the middle of doing it, it might feel a bit bizarre, but actually it literally takes old patterns, old memories, and it basically puts a new barcode on it. It changes it. And as you change old memories, which is where the patterns are actually derived from, you change the outcome. But when the outcome changes now, it feels very congruent and very easy and very smooth.
Yeah, amazing. And then, Tanya, I'm just curious to know, have you got any books you'd recommend or like further reading resources for people if they want to go away and check some stuff out?
There have been a couple of books that have been absolute game changers for me. One of them is by a chap called Dr. Joe Dispenza, he was a chiropractor by training, but ended up breaking his back and healing.
Absolute legend.
And one of his books which was just mind blowing to me and put together a lot of my science and a lot of my learnings is Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself. And it talks about that mind-body link in a much deeper way, and it explains some things about how to help yourself. Another one is Dr. Bruce Lipton, The Biology of Belief. It basically talks about how we're set up to respond to our environment. He was a cell biologist and then had some pretty big aha moments. These two books were absolute game changers for me. But if you're looking at NLP, you can go to source. You can look up anything by Richard Bandler, Mr. Grinder. There's lots of books out there on NLP, and the different styles of writing will suit different styles of reader.
Yeah, amazing. Well, Tanya, thank you so much. And where can people find you online, or where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Well, there's lots of ways of finding me. I'm Tanya Collins. My website is www.creatingcorechange.co.uk. I have a Facebook page for my business, which is Creating Core Change Transformational Coaching. I'm happy to have initial consults with people, happy to talk about what I do because it's sufficiently unusual that I'm more than, if people want to engage me just to work out whether they want to find out more than happy to chat.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, Tanya, thank you so much for your time. It's been such a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a real honour. Thank you very much indeed.
Hey there, guys. So that was it. First ever episode of the Asking Experts series. We're going to be back soon with normal interviews with creatives, but I'm going to throw one of these in every now and again as soon as I find someone that can add some value to you. So yeah, if you're not already following us on Instagram and Facebook, we are at The Creative Venture. If you have an Apple device as well, I'd really appreciate a review on iTunes. It just helps this podcast get seen. We're not going to be around next week, but I will see you the week after. But we'll have plenty going on the social channel. So follow the Creative Venture podcast.